nation,
under God,
under God,
indivisible,
indivisible,
with liberty
with liberty
and justice
and justice
for all.
for all.
That's the Pledge of Allegiance. We're going to say that every day. We're also going to get a Christian flag, and you're going to pledge your allegiance to Jesus.
I have debated for a really long time whether I wanted to share this. I just feel like with everything that's going on right now, it's really important that I share my story. I am not trying to call out anyone from my past, but I really wanted to talk about how systems, organizations, religions, political parties, etc., can really take unhealthy thinking patterns in people and just really intensify them and make them so much worse, and just really fan the flames on unhealthy behavior. Because the truth is, with these mass movements of people that want to other groups of people, blame them for certain problems in society, it all starts at an individual level of dysfunctional and antisocial behavior patterns. And I have had to learn through a lot of therapy to undo a lot of those thinking patterns in myself, because I was raised in this kind of ideology. And so that's really kind of the lens that I want to discuss this through, is just kind of talking about how it starts at an individual level and grows into like a mass movement like this. The fact is that Christian nationalism has become a cult. I have watched as their beliefs started out as like very niche to becoming very, very mainstream. A lot of people are becoming involved in this way of thinking right now. People that used to be like sort of average Jesus touting Christians seem to be abandoning the teachings of Jesus altogether in order to try to advance American Christian conservatism. It took me until I was 25 to actually start deconstructing Christian nationalism. There were definitely several ideas that I did not vibe with before that, but I didn't really start to see it for what it was until then. If you are a Christian, if you homeschool, if you're involved in organizations like this, I just need you to truly understand like what these organizations stand for, where their values come from, and like ultimately where they're headed as a group, and what their agenda and goal is ultimately. Because I feel like a lot of you out there don't actually jive with all of that. And I'm personal witness to some of the most hardcore of these beliefs. So I need to get the word out there of what it really is. It is truly eroding Christianity from the inside. It is completely distorting the actual teachings of Jesus. I also want you to know that if you grew up like me in one of these families and you're starting to question things, there is a reason that you should be questioning these things, because they are extreme, they are unhealthy, and they are just straight up weird and creepy, I'll be honest. It doesn't sit right with you for a reason. I'm just going to take a minute to actually define Christian nationalism. I just want to add a quick note here that my parents don't actually call themselves Christian nationalists. They would call themselves Christian conservatives. But the policies that Christian conservatives advocate for are very much Christian nationalist in nature, because they involve government overreach into the personal choices of citizens in order to impose Christian morality on the whole country. So back to defining Christian nationalism. So this is via Wikipedia. Christian nationalism is a form of religious nationalism that focuses on promoting the Christian views of its followers in order to achieve prominence or dominance in political, cultural, and social life. And the subpage, Christian Nationalism in the United States, says Christian nationalism asserts that the United States is a country founded by and for Christians. So basically, it takes the idea of America, which is supposed to be a free country for the free expression of all religions, all identities, all ways of being, and says that actually America was founded by Christians, for a Christian way of life, and our laws should enforce a Christian way of life on everyone, whether they're a Christian or not. This is a myth, as anyone who has actually studied history knows, but what's actually in our founding documents is a desire for freedom of religion, which is all types of religion. I just want to talk a little bit more about this myth before I move on, so I'm adding some context here. The only mention of religion in our Constitution says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's it. No other mention of religion. The Declaration of Independence has the phrase, the laws of nature and nature's God, which feels more inclusive to me, and also uses the phrase endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, which also seems fairly inclusive. These documents by no means indicate that America is a Christian nation. Another huge facet of this myth is the story of the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving. I remember this story being very much emphasized in my education. The myth says that the Pilgrims were Protestants suffering religious persecution from Catholicism in Europe. So they came to the New World to seek religious freedom. There is some truth to this story, but in the grand story of America, there were many early colonies by many different countries. These people most commonly were coming to America to seek fortune, economic opportunity. So mainly money was the reason and not religious persecution. The Plymouth colony was a real colony, but it was by no means super prominent or important in the story of America. The story of the feast at Plymouth, the myth of the first Thanksgiving, this feast did actually happen, but was not technically a day of Thanksgiving. The story was popularized by Sarah Josepha Hale, who advocated for a national day of Thanksgiving throughout the mid-1800s. Eventually, Abraham Lincoln did make it a national holiday. But, and this is where the story gets interesting, in the late 1800s, there began to be increased immigration of Catholics and Jews to America. Protestant Americans began to see this as a threat to Protestantism. So, they used the myth of the Pilgrims to say that God had given the Protestants at Plymouth claim to this new land by divine providence. So, that makes everything make way more sense, and we can obviously see some of those same themes still alive today. It's why these Protestant denominations of Christianity still see other religions, immigrants, progressives as a threat to their way of life, and continue to emphasize this story that America is a Christian nation. Okay, now that we have that context, let's get back to talking about how I grew up. A really, really big way that Christian nationalism has advanced their movement is by raising children in the movement and by having a lot of children. So today I'm going to discuss how I was raised in this movement and how it encourages people to stay in the movement and really, really discourages people to leave. So my parents were part of the very early Christian conservative movement in the 90s. They were on the board of a Christian conservative activism group in our state. During this time, they became very afraid of non-Christian influences on their family. And so when I became school age, they decided that they were going to homeschool me. Me and my siblings were all homeschooled kindergarten through high school, never had any formal education. As far as daily life for me, this meant that I hardly ever left the house. except to maybe go to the grocery store with my mom sometimes or eat out at a restaurant. We went to church, but we didn't go every Sunday because my mom's health was not great. I didn't really have any friends because we weren't part of a homeschool group or anything like that. And our church attendance was so sporadic that there were never any close relationships formed. I just remember feeling a really terrible void of loneliness. And I remember having this pervasive feeling of like, people don't understand our family, or we're different than other families and other people don't get it. And like, when are we going to find another family that is like us or has some things in common with us or interests in common? And some of this goes beyond the Christian nationalism part, but the pervasive fear of outside influence was a really big part of it. I never went anywhere without adult supervision. The closest thing to normalcy I ever got was attending youth group in high school, and that was sporadic as well. When I finally did move out, I was extremely unequipped to deal with normal life. I barely knew how to talk to strangers because I was taught to fear strangers. I just, like, in so many ways, I still feel like a kid inside because I did not get those formative experiences of, like, making friends and learning how to go places by myself, how to talk to adults. I really did not have any of those normal experiences. I remember my mom would watch Fox News, like, basically all day while they were trying to be extremely like careful protecting us from, you know, inappropriate things. I was hearing like horrific news stories about tragedies all day on the TV. From as young as I can remember, I was afraid to even go in my front yard because my mom told me that there were child predators out there who would kidnap me. I remember very vividly her walking me through scenarios of how other kids had been kidnapped because they were too gullible and they talked to strangers, etc. And I was just like, I was so scared of everything. Like, there's a reason that I still have a serious startle reflex. Like, I was scared. It's crazy how to this day, just socializing gets my heart rate up. I had really severe social anxiety for like most of my 20s. Now that I'm in my 30s and I've kind of been out of the house for about 10 years, just now, it's like not as extremely fear-inducing as it used to be. So my homeschooling consisted entirely of the Abeka curriculum. Abeka is the homeschooling curriculum created by Pensacola Christian College. They are an extremely conservative Christian university. Like, extreme. I'm very serious. I'm pretty sure that on campus, women had to wear skirts until, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. I decided to check this, and on screen I have the current Pensacola Christian College student handbook. And as far as I can tell, I'm pretty sure girls still have to wear dresses on weekdays before 5 p.m. Maybe I'm misreading this, but it's very confusing and still seems extremely strict. And to this day, you are not allowed to color your hair and you're not allowed to have tattoos. Okay, so that's how extreme we're talking. This is who created the curriculum that I was raised on. I can't underestimate this, okay? These textbooks are not textbooks. They are religious and political propaganda through and through. I actually bought some of them recently at a thrift store because I wanted to remember what was actually in them. And it's like, it is stark, the difference between an actual academic textbook and these books. An academic textbook actually like gives you the information. It's like, these are the theories on this, this, and this. These are how experts in the field think about this, but these other experts say this. Like, it's an impartial collection of information that is supposed to be educational for you to, learn all the different ways of thinking about things. Every sentence in these Abeka books is just dripping with hatred and judgment. Like, it is crazy reading it back. It very clearly twists the facts to create a specific narrative in your mind. Okay, so here I have United States History in Christian Perspective, Heritage of Freedom, with the classic bald eagle and American flag on the front. It would not be a Christian nationalist book without those two things. So here I am in the section on the Civil War. In the early years of the Republic, most people in both the North and the South agreed that slavery should be abolished as soon as abolition became feasible. The majority of Americans felt that it should be done gradually. So that is a straight up lie. The South did not want to abolish slavery. Slavery was their whole economy. They did not want to abolish slavery at all. But this is the narrative that Christian nationalists use to blame the Civil War on the North. Basically, they set up this narrative that the South wanted to gradually get rid of slavery and the North just wanted to abolish it immediately, like purposely to destroy the Southern economy, basically. So this is at the point where the Republican Party was founded and Lincoln has been elected. It says here, in both North and South, emotions had largely displaced clear thinking. Now, a political party seemingly organized to oppose the very basis of the Southern way of life controlled the White House. Lincoln's sincere personal promises did not relieve the threat of having the Republican Party in power. The South was in despair. So basically, the whole narrative here is that the North was trying to accelerate abolition as fast as possible, and that their acceleration caused the Civil War to happen because the South was like, we can't just have our slaves ripped away. We have to do it slowly, which is not, it's just not true. The South wanted to keep their slaves. Here's another section where they set up the narrative. It literally says here, the South rises to preserve states' rights. It says, the Southern states said they were fighting not to preserve the institution of slavery, but to preserve states' rights. So basically they're trying to say here that they didn't want the federal government to decide for the whole country that slavery was illegal, but that each state should individually decide that slavery was illegal, and they wanted to preserve the states' rights to make those decisions. No. It was about slavery. It was about racism. So this is not an academic textbook. This is a propaganda device. Here's a section on Native Americans and their religion. It says, the Native Americans, like most early people, forsook the things they once knew about God. Rather than worshiping the Creator, they worshipped creation, particularly things they could not understand, such as thunder, wind, fire, and the sun. They also believed that spirits lived in the mountains, water, trees, plants, and animals around them. Because superstition kept the Indians from working together to develop the land in which they lived, America would remain an untamed wilderness until the Europeans arrived. So this is also setting up the narrative that white people invented capitalism, and capitalism is good because capitalism creates industry, builds cities, and basically this idea that living in harmony with nature is bad, and we were actually meant to subdue nature, not live with nature or among nature. And this comes from the story in Genesis, where it literally says, subdue the earth, something like that. I wish that I could have found the book on economics. That one is crazy. That one is really crazy. It basically praises capitalism as if it was invented by God, basically. As if it is the perfect system of economics. It basically worships capitalism as if it's also a religion. It's crazy. Of course, this curriculum also teaches creationism. Here I have a book called Old World History and Geography in Christian Perspective. So, the beginnings of human history, the creation of man. God's creation of Adam and Eve, the first man and woman, marks the beginning of human history. So right off the bat, we are erasing everything that scientists know about natural history. That's just like didn't happen, basically. Here we have concepts to consider. Man did not evolve. In our modern world, many people make up imaginary stories about early man. They teach that man is a product of evolution, the false idea that man began as an animal and slowly evolved into man. People who say this do not have any real evidence that their idea is true, but they choose to believe it because they do not want to accept the Bible. As they move farther away from the Bible in their thinking, their ideas about early man get more and more fanciful. People who believe that man came from animals often argue amongst themselves about their ideas because each of them has a different story of what early man was really like. There is no scientific evidence that man evolved from animals, and all the evidence we have shows that the idea of evolution is not true. That was underlined. Okay. Can you see it now? They're not like, oh, some people believe in evolution, but we believe in the story in the Bible. No, they're like, these people are liars. And they do it because they do not want to accept God. Okay? That's just straight up not true. Saying that there's no scientific evidence, that's just not true. But I want you, just think about this. I don't know, what grade is this? Okay, this is 5th grade. Yeah, so you're literally 10 years old reading this. How are you supposed to know any different? There's no way for you to know any different. This is what you're growing up with being the facts. I can't really tell you how damaging this is. Not only is it just straight up not true, but it isn't allowing the person to come to their own conclusion about things. It is straight up telling them how to think, which is not healthy. Okay, sorry, I had to take a little break and now the lighting is different. So to finish talking about Abeka, the whole curriculum is very good at setting up a strong us versus them mentality, which is another hallmark of cult behavior. Christian nationalism is full of us versus them sort of fear-based thinking. The reason it fits so well with the Bible is because the Bible as a narrative also has a very strong good versus evil, God versus the devil, heaven versus hell type thing going on. In the eyes of a Christian nationalist, every person that has an opinion that disagrees with their interpretation of the Bible, their interpretation key, is evil and controlled by the devil, or at best, simply just foolish. And in the Bible, you are taught to fear sin and the devil. The devil is lurking around every corner to trick you. And this starts at the very beginning in Genesis, when the snake comes out of the garden that God created and tricks Eve into sinning, basically. So from the very beginning, you learn this story as a child, and you're like, the devil is waiting to trick me into sinning. So then you start to see scientists talking about evolution as the devil trying to trick you into not believing in God anymore. There's so much more that I could say about my growing up experience, but that was the gist of it. I was just very, very isolated and indoctrinated and not taught to think for myself, which was very bizarre because I was actually being told that I was taught to be an independent thinker who wasn't just swayed by the ideas of the world. It's like really twisted. There are a couple of other concepts that I learned in therapy that I forgot to mention here. The first one being scapegoating. This is when one person is often the target of the upset or anger of another person or multiple people. Most often, this happens if there is a narcissist in the family or the workplace. They will target someone specifically to receive blame for all the problems, when ultimately many of the problems are actually caused by selfish choices of the narcissist. The scapegoat serves ultimately as a distraction, so the narcissist never has to address any real problems or look at their own behavior, and they rope everyone else into seeing the scapegoat as the problem to redirect it away from themselves. We see this at play a lot in conservative politics when they blame unemployment on Mexican immigration, or a bad job market on DEI, or mass shootings on trans people. Sometimes these scapegoats do have a small bearing on the issue, but often they are really not connected at all. Problems are often much more complex than having one simple cause or solution. And if you look at who is so frequently pointing the finger, if you look at where their interests might lie, you might find out more about the cause of the problem. In general, it's just very appealing for people to have an easy target for their anger, so scapegoating is very common. The other concept is magical thinking. This one is a bit more innocent, but it's basically just the tendency of people to have a very hopeful and optimistic view of their problems, where they have this really enduring belief that if this one thing happens, all my problems will be solved. If I get this one job, if I can just get a girlfriend, etc. Ultimately, it's also magical thinking to think that all the problems in society at large have very simple solutions. It's just much easier to think of problems as having simple solutions. So people very often gravitate towards politicians, pastors, etc. that have a very simple, easy to grasp solution for the world's problems. In truth, the world is extremely diverse and has very diverse problems that require a lot of really difficult work with diverse solutions to solve effectively. And that's just not a fun, catchy, buzzword way of thinking about the world. It's very complicated. But now I'm going to talk about how I actually got out. So I didn't really start to get out of Christian nationalism specifically until I was about 25 years old. I had started to deconstruct some of the ideas around purity culture and things like that before then, like when I started having my first relationships in my early 20s. And that's a whole other friggin' story. But it was during the pandemic when I saw all of my family and my whole community suddenly become anti-maskers. And I was like, that doesn't make sense. In fact, it really doesn't seem loving. It definitely doesn't seem like it's looking out for the most vulnerable in our community. In this case, being like people who are immunocompromised. It seemed straight up crazy to me because I was raised in church. I was raised on the teachings of Jesus. I was even told that Jesus' teachings are like the most foundational, basically, to the Christian faith. And I like the teachings of Jesus still. And I was just like, I don't think Jesus would have been going around making like his freedom to not wear a mask his most important like perspective in the middle of a pandemic. That seems crazy to me. So when that started happening, I was like, that's weird. That's a red flag. I really don't like that. And then when the situation with George Floyd happened and I saw the protests happening and I watched the video for myself, I was like, what is this all about? And thankfully at this point, I had Black people around me in my life. My boyfriend, who is now my husband, is from Africa. He immigrated when he was a teenager. And he just kind of gave me like the basic level education of the perspective of Black people and what they in reality have to face living in America. I was completely unaware that pretty much every Black parent has to have a talk with their child about being extremely appeasing to police officers to avoid escalating a conflict. And this is like a universal experience in this country. And I was like, oh, okay. And like just hearing the perspectives of the people that these things were actually happening to, I was like, oh, like it makes way more sense what they're saying versus what I was taught growing up. And it also makes way more sense that the people who originally held the slaves kind of like has passed down this belief about Black people. That's what makes the most logical sense. So at this time, I really started to allow a lot more different types of perspectives into my sphere. I started following people on social media who were not in the Christian nationalist realm. I'd been following some of these people before, but I kind of like tuned out some of the things that they had to say on politics, and then I started listening. So a lot of things in my life started to make way more sense, and I could see pretty much right away that a lot of the things that I was taught were not really true. But I was very much unaware of like the serious level of damage that was done to me by the way I was raised. That would come later after I got married, and I struggled in a lot of ways in my marriage because of like the isolation that I had endured. I really didn't know how to make friends. I didn't know how to be an adult. I didn't know how to do anything without almost relying on my husband to be everything for me, which in a lot of ways, that is what Christian nationalism teaches. They kind of teach women to stay at home, clean the house for the man, and like let the man decide what they get to know, or even like what they get to believe about things. Like women are just not really supposed to be independent or independent thinkers. So when I got married, I was really struggling with deconstructing these ideas about women and femininity. Once I realized how deep my issues went, I did finally decide to go to therapy. I grew up with a lot of skepticism around therapy. I didn't even mention that my parents were also anti-vaxxers, so I hadn't seen a doctor pretty much almost my entire growing up years. So it had taken a long time for me to actually decide that this was the right move, and it was not just for people that were like clinically insane or whatever. It was in therapy that I started to learn about codependency and the fawn trauma response, complex PTSD, and a lot of these things really resonated with me, and again, made so many things in my life make a lot more sense. The thing that really, really changed my life was when I learned about boundaries. And I was like, oh, I was raised to actually like not have any boundaries. Fundamental Christianity is very, very authoritarian. They kind of sell it to you as like protection. Like, we are giving you all of these rules in order to protect you, but in reality, they're doing it to control your behavior. And my boundaries were crossed in every way. I was also parentified. I had to take care of my younger siblings. And I was just overall expected to be way more mature than I ever should have been because I was literally a child. But the main way that my boundaries were crossed that I'll talk about today is just mental boundaries. Telling someone how to think is crossing a mental boundary. They have to be allowed to have their own process to develop how they think about something. That includes children. Yes, you're supposed to help children in learning how to think, but you cannot tell them how to think. And I showed you earlier in those books, they straight up tell you how to think. And they say that you are being deceived by evil people if you think differently. That is an extremely manipulative boundary crossing. It keeps you from thinking differently by making you scared. And it keeps you from questioning by shaming you for asking the wrong questions. So after I understood the concept of boundaries just in my own relationships, I started to extrapolate out and realize that Christian nationalist rhetoric at the very core is just a huge boundary crossing. They claim that they actually want more freedom, but in reality, all of their policies are really about controlling other people's behavior based on their own religious beliefs. This obviously is a violation of separation of church and state in many, many ways, which they also claim to support that, but that's really just because they don't want there to be one church. And it's as if they don't really understand the actual, much bigger reasons than that for separation of church and state. But it was literally, mind-blowing for me that in reality, in order to be a good Christian, which I still consider myself a Christian today, you actually don't have to want to impose your morality on other people, because that is crossing a boundary. I thought that in order to be a good Christian, you had to support all of these laws, you had to stand up for moral behavior in the public sphere, you had to want the Bible in schools, all of these things. But that's literally not what Christianity is about. Christianity is about a personal transformation for you. A personal transformation of your heart, of your soul. It is totally okay, and in fact, very healthy for you to have your own convictions, but to not impose your convictions on someone else. That's when it gets unhealthy, is when you start getting on a judgmental high horse and saying, oh, I do this, and therefore I'm better than you. There's even verses in the Bible against doing that, but I've been to a 12-step group for codependency as well. And one of the main things that I learned there is that you cannot control another person. You can only control yourself. And this is just a really basic idea that I feel like I hear a lot of people talking about more. But Christian nationalist rhetoric, at its core, is seeking to control other people. And once I realized that, I was like, wow. So this is what I was talking about at the top, about how unhealthy behaviors personally, individually with people grow into movements of unhealthy ideas. My parents, among other people, come up with this idea that they don't want their kids to be influenced by non-Christian things in the school. So then they decide that the Bible should be in the school and taught as historical fact. They couldn't keep their own personal beliefs just for their own family. They had to impose it on other people. So at a baseline, that's the unhealthy idea that grows into this kind of a movement. I want you to understand that these people are not crazed lunatics or whatever. They're just extremely fearful people. They truly do think that they are protecting their children and their way of life they see it as impossible for them to practice their way of life and let other people practice a different way of life. They see other people's way of life as a direct threat to their own. And they see other people's way of life as like the devil trying to seduce them. And so they're so afraid that they have to get rid of this threat, which is why they have to make it illegal. Whatever behavior it is that they don't want around them. The children in these families very often think that they are being taught to think for themselves, but they can't see and don't yet understand the very powerful forces of fear, manipulation, withholding of information, and social pressure of the group to stay in the group and to continue thinking like the group. To me, Christian nationalism officially became a cult when Trump came on the scene and basically became the very charismatic leader. Everything is all about how the media is lying about him. Everyone is lying about him. Everyone is misrepresenting him. And that is another hallmark of a cult as well. Once faithful followers of the movement become convinced that everyone is lying about the leader can do no wrong, the leader, there's no legitimate criticism against the leader, that is a very bad sign. I mentioned earlier that Christianity is about a personal transformation inside of you, but I can't ignore the fact that evangelical Christianity has taken the Great Commission, which says to go out and share the good news with the world, and really, really twisted its meaning. Another hallmark of a cult is a very high focus on recruitment, and evangelical Christians and Christian nationalists alike have used the Great Commission as their permission to go out and persuade, manipulate, coerce everyone into joining the movement. Evangelical Christians believe that if you don't accept Jesus as your personal savior before you die, that you will go to hell. This creates a very, very strong fear-based motivation for Christians to go out and share the gospel at every point that they can. That's why you might have a Christian checking out with you at the grocery store that doesn't know you at all, saying things like, "Can I pray for you?" or trying to talk to you about their church or about religion or whatever. I remember feeling so much guilt that I did not want to have these gospel conversations with people or strangers. It just felt so weird to me to turn an ordinary friendship into this agenda to try to get them to be a Christian. That just never sat right with me. Come to find out later in therapy that it is not healthy to have an agenda for your friendships, number one, but also to be trying to convince somebody or change the way that they think about something. So evangelicals have taken the Great Commission to mean not only that they have to share the gospel at every turn or else they are not doing their job and all these people are going to go to hell, but also taken it to mean that they need to go out to all these indigenous cultures in the world and go tell them how lost they are in their ways, how sinful they are, and how they need to completely give up their entire culture in order to change to Christianity. They don't recognize any other ways of spirituality or living in the world. It is their way that is correct. It is very, very much about certainty and having access to the right information. They are very, very uncomfortable with the idea of uncertainty. I can't even describe to you what a huge boundary crossing it is to walk into somebody else's culture and tell them that they are all wrong and everything is wrong about the way that they live their life, and then shame them for it And obviously to go in and then forcefully steal their culture from them for their own good, yeah, that's just evil. I'll say it straight up. That's evil. And before I finish talking about the recruitment focus of evangelicals, I have to mention their favorite recruitment tactic, which of course is having 1 million children and indoctrinating them into the movement. If you're not familiar with the Quiverful movement, the most well-known Quiverful people are probably the Duggars, who have 19 children. These people actually believe that birth control of any kind is morally wrong, and that the size of your family should be left up to God, not taking into consideration at all financial concerns, the concerns for the health of the mother, concerns for the quality of life of the children, none of that. So within the Quiverful movement, you see a lot of child neglect happen. I was parentified myself in a similar way. The way a lot of these girls are within the movement, they are expected to be like a surrogate mother to their siblings because there are too many siblings for the mother to really be able to handle on her own. My family was not Quiverful. I was parentified simply because her health in general life was not very good. And so I'm very, very familiar with the kind of like neglect that happens in these families. They are having all these children because in their eyes, they are raising like an army of the Lord. They'll literally use those words. I remember there was a song that I used to listen to as a kid that was called Army of the Lord, and it was like a little kid's song. These kind of ideas come from the Old Testament stories about Israel committing genocide against other people and it being seen as like a holy war that was ridding the earth of sinful people. So it makes perfect sense why so many evangelicals are siding with Israel in the current conflict. And let's not forget that these people love the Second Amendment. They love guns, and they have a lot of guns. And so the idea of them taking up arms to defend their way of life is not a far-fetched idea. And what's crazy is they will gladly die for the cause because they literally see themselves as like a martyr for Christ. In fact, there's pretty much no higher honor for an evangelical than to die for their faith. I certainly hope and pray that it does not come to that. But I just want everybody out there to be aware of what is really happening here. Again, I am not making this video to call out anyone in my family. This is not about anybody personally. This is about how systems and organizations manipulate people and exploit unhealthy thinking in order to create these mass movements. Being in a cult leads you to doing things that you would not normally do otherwise and can take you down a very, very dark path. If you are a Christian, if you are a part of homeschool organizations or any of these political organizations, like, I just need you to understand what these people actually stand for. Like, I'm not joking that they are so extreme that they would happily repeal women's right to vote. I just wanted to insert this right here. This is a clip from a CNN piece on well-known Christian nationalist Doug Wilson and a couple of his associate pastors.
In my ideal society, we would vote as households. And I would ordinarily be the one that would cast the vote, but I would cast the vote having discussed it with my household.
There are some who have gone so far as to say that they want the 19th Amendment repealed.
I would support that. And I'd support it on the basis that the The atomization that comes with our current system is not good for humans.
Okay, so that was scary, but as if that wasn't scary enough, Pete Hegseth, the current Secretary of Defense, tweeted that full interview with the caption, "All of Christ for all of life." So I think it's pretty safe to say, sounds like he has the same vision for America as well, and he's actually in government, not to mention the fact that his position was actually just renamed the Secretary of War, because our Department of Defense was just renamed the Department of War by Trump. So this is not good. Like, they literally want the most traditional way of life to be enacted by law. They actually think that it would be for everyone's good, for the good of society, if that were to happen. It's terrifyingly close to Handmaid's Tale, honestly. Please be safe. Really pay attention and vet for yourself who it is that you're following, who it is that you are getting your ideas from, where they are coming from. Really investigate these things for yourself, because this cult movement is bringing in more people by the day. You'd never think that you could end up in a cult, but the fact is that anybody could, because they exploit people's vulnerabilities for their own gain. Anyway, that's all I have for you. I kind of want to make this into like a multi-episode podcast series where I talk more in depth about some of these things. I have a lot to say, and I feel like a podcast might be the best venue for that. But don't worry, I'm still planning on doing my regular content of like vlogs and lifestyle videos and stuff, because honestly, that content is keeping me personally sane right now, because the world is so scary, and sometimes I just need to see somebody make a coffee and read a book to remind me that life is going to be okay, ultimately. So I'm still going to be making those videos, but I want to be releasing some of these as well. If you're new here, please subscribe. Hopefully I'm going to be making more of these. If you grew up in this movement like me, please share in the comments so that we can have some community and share our experiences together. I will see you in the next one. All right, bye.